Okay, welcome to the introduction to All Quiet on the Western Front in World War I. I haven't changed yet, that's Ms. Press and Ms. Van Beek, but this is our introduction to our next English unit. So first, think about what do you know about what years World War I was fought. If you remember, you might remember that it was 1914 to 1918. This is a picture of trenches with barbed wire in front of them. So that was a 4-year war. Think about what you know about what countries were fighting. Again, we're dredging up schema here. So if you notice on the map, we've got kind of two sides. We have the purple countries, United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Russia, and Serbia, who are one group. Then we have this green group that's the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then you've got another group that's Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire that eventually joined those guys in green. And then you have these red groups, and I'm not sure what group those are part of. So we have two main groups, though, the Allied forces, Russia, France, England, and the United States, and then the Central Powers, which is Germany, where our main character, Paul, is going to be from, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, the Turks, and Bulgaria all joined together on the other side. So this is a war of alliances. Okay, we want to think about how many people were killed or injured. And before we go into those numbers, take a second and look at the picture. You'll notice something odd about the graves. And you might have noticed that the people digging the graves are both women, which is odd because it's usually a man's job. So think about why we would have this image of women during World War I digging so many graves. And then the answer becomes obvious, is that clearly the men are away or dying. So let's look at some of the numbers about fatalities and about injuries during the war. So 9 million military people were killed, and this is in 4 years of war, 9 million. There was an additional 22 million that were wounded, and it's important to remember in World War I that these weren't wounds like you got a cut on your finger or you broke an arm. These were wounds like you lost half of your face or you lost your legs. So these were severe wounds. 7 million of those wounded were permanently disabled as a result of their wound, and I don't think that includes people with shell shock. It's important to notice that in addition to the 9 million military that were killed, 9 million civilians were also killed. So there was collateral damage during this war. So that's really hard to get our heads around exactly how many people that was. But if we take 18 million people killed in 4 years, and we look at average deaths per day across 4 years, that averages out to 8,738. People who died per day, which again is hard to get our heads around until we start thinking about populations of high schools in our district. So Hillsdale's population is about 1,300, and we're kind of an average size high school in our district. So thinking about 8,700 people dying, that's like every single person and teacher at Hillsdale and at San Mateo and at Aragon and at Mills and at Burlingame. I think that adds up to about 8,700 people per day. That would be all of those people at all 5 of those campuses coming together and all dying once on one day, but every day for 4 years. And then we start to get a sense of the enormity of the toll of this war. Okay, so you should be asking, based on those numbers, what was it about this war that produced such high death tolls? So one thing you need to know about is trench warfare. So if you look in the middle, you'll notice this is a cross-section of a trench. And so in the middle, where it dumps down, that's called a trench, and that's where the soldiers would have stood. To the right of the trench, you see a pile of sandbags, and that's to keep the wall from collapsing under bombardment. And at the very top, you have an arrow pointing toward the enemy front line. So this is a long trench that was cut through the ground in which the soldiers would stand behind the revêtement, the front wall on the trench board, and they would stand in there to be protected from crossfire. Periodically, they would need to go out over the sandbag wall toward the enemy front line, across the parapet, through the wire-tangled defenses, and go running across no man's land to attack, and then return. And you notice behind the trench there's more sandbags and a machine gun where they would fire out at anybody who came to attack them. This is an actual photograph so you can see how it matches up to the cross section. So you see the soldier in the front facing toward enemy lines. You also see lots of people either dead or possibly sleeping, who are kind of waiting it out in the trenches. So this is where soldiers who were on the front lines went to fight the war. This is another picture looking out toward the barbed wire at a tank coming to get them, and you'll notice how soldiers are down below the line of fire in shell holes to stay protected from flying bullets. This is a diagram of the trench system. So down at the bottom, no man's land, that's that direction toward the enemy front line. So between the two front lines, there was an area sometimes as narrow as 100 yards, like a single football field. And on the other side of that no man's land would be this exact same picture in reverse. As you go back from no man's land, you notice some wire obstacles. So that would be barbed wire hung up to keep people from coming through easily. And then more barbed wire entanglement, a defense line right behind that. The number 4s are in the front line trench, and that was like the picture that we just saw. So those are cut into the ground. They have little notches in them to keep, if a soldier gets into them or a bomb explodes, it keeps the shrapnel from being blown down the trench too far. It stops right where the cuts are. Behind the front line trench, there's another line of barbed wire. And behind that is 2s and 3s. Those are frontline support. So that would be food, that would be places for people to get back from the front if the front lines were damaged, if they needed a break, things like that. Behind that is the first support line trench. And back there would be where more food and supplies were. Behind that is the artillery line, and so that's large cannons that would fire and try to bombard the other side before our soldiers would rush out of those trenches and go running across no man's land. Here's some pictures from above to help you picture. You see all those little black dots are German soldiers' helmets filling the trenches that are cut into the ground. So this is a picture taken from an airplane. When it was your time to crawl out of your trench, crawl over those sandbags, crawl through the barbed wire, and go running across that area called no man's land, the order was to go over the top. And this is a picture of Italian soldiers going over the top. Take a minute to imagine how terrifying that would be, to leave the relative safety of the trench, to put yourself in total vulnerability, to try to crawl through that barbed wire, to run across open field where you were basically target practice for the other side, to try to climb down into the other side to do something, and then to somehow get back out of that trench to run back to your own side and try to get back to safety. It obviously didn't work out well for lots and lots and lots of people. And this is a picture of a Russian soldier caught in that barbed wire. In addition to the trench warfare system, there were lots of weapons that were kind of invented or made popular during World War I that contributed to those high death tolls. So grenades, you can see the sandbags. Imagine why grenades would be so useful is that you had to try to clear a path ahead of yourself. You could throw those without leaving your trench, so grenades were important. Cannons, again way back behind the front lines, would bombard the enemy and try to destroy some of their trenches and get them off guard before the attacking soldiers left their trenches and went running across. Tanks were invented at the end of World War I, and you can imagine why these were such a huge advantage. When people were hidden in trenches, this would protect you as you ran through no man's land. Instead of being a running soldier, you were in this kind of armored car. And then bayonets were used for close quarters fighting. So when you ran over the no man's land and jumped into the trench on the other side, sometimes you might be too close to the enemy to even shoot. And at that point was when soldiers would use their bayonets for hand-to-hand fighting, which is pretty gruesome, and we see that in All Quiet on the Western Front. The other weapon that is super closely associated with World War I goes with this image. And if you said, oh yeah, that's a gas mask, you were right. Poisonous gas was a weapon that they used in World War I, and it was very quickly outlawed as illegal during war after this war because it was so deadly. There were multiple kinds of gas that they used. Chlorine gas caused its victims to drown in the water produced in their own lungs, so you drown just sitting up. Phosgene gas was 18 times more powerful than chlorine gas, had the same effect, and it took its victims 48 hours to die, and the whole time they would cough up liters of yellow froth from their lungs. And then mustard gas was a burning gas which burned exposed skin, sometimes to the bone, and could also burn out lungs. So these were all kinds of gas that would be released. Some of them were colorless and smellless, and you can imagine the paranoia of sitting in a trench not knowing if gas had been released, sitting with your gas mask on, not knowing if it was safe to take your gas mask off, because if you were wrong, the results could be terrible. This is a famous painting by John Singer Sargent called Gassed. That's a picture of people who have been victims of gas, and they're walking past a field of the dead and the dying. And so this is one of the big kind of emblematic images of World War I battle is this gas. A little bit of background about All Quiet on the Western Front. It was written in 1928. If you remember, the war ended in 1918, so this was written 10 years after World War I was over. The book is a first-person account of a German soldier named Paul Baumer, who's 18 to 20 years old. Notice that our author's name is Erich Maria Remarque, so this is not an autobiographical story. This is a fictional story, even though it's written in the first person. And the author was later criticized for being anti-Nazi and anti-war. They actually banned this book during the rise of Nazi Germany. Part of the reason they probably banned it is because Remarque is very interested in the common experience of war, how all of us, regardless of our side during a war, are all alike in need and desire. And so a lot of All Quiet explores the similarities and commonalities between you and your enemy. All Quiet's main character is a guy named Paul Baumer. And this is not a picture of Paul Baumer. Again, he's a fictional person. This is a picture of Siegfried Sassoon, who is one of the poets in the packet of poetry that we'll be using. Paul Baumer is a German soldier. He tells the story in a first-person narrative. But let's think about how this is different from an autobiography. Again, All Quiet on the Western Front is not an autobiography. It is a fictional story about a German soldier written by somebody who had been a German soldier, but Paul Baumer is a fictional character. Okay, so it's important to remember that Erich Remarque is not the same as Paul Baumer, because that's confusing for everyone. The setting of All Quiet on the Western Front is the Western Front of France and Germany. So if you look on the borderline between France, which is yellow, and Germany, which is pink, you'll see that long line with a dashed line and a red line. That's the Western Front. And so that was a long line of trenches that were facing each other. That was the front of fighting between France, that was one side of the war, and Germany, which was another side. The book itself covers several battles over the course of 3 years, and it also covers 2 leaves, which are trips home away from the front. So we'll see Paul go to battle, we'll see Paul travel between the front line and the camps. So he'll fight, he'll go home, and then he'll take these annual leaves home. And you'll see Paul kind of all over. I want you to think about how we hear about war as well. How do we learn about what happened? And so in your groups, brainstorm a quick list of ways we learn about war. We learn about war from individual accounts, and you will be creating your own soldier or nurse through which to tell the story of the war. And you'll be wanting to think about, how did this character feel during the war? How did it affect him or her? And be thinking about what kind of impact war has on individuals. And then last, let's leave with Remarque's words himself. At the very beginning of the book, he gives us a kind of prologue where he explains exactly what his project is in this book. And he says, "This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war." So think about what Remarque is trying to do with this book. He's not trying to accuse, he's not trying to confess, but mostly, he says, he does not want to portray war as an adventure. And you'll see that he feels very betrayed by those who in his youth, or Paul Baumer feels very betrayed by those in his youth who did portray war as a great adventure. So we'll be looking at how war impacts individuals, how Paul feels about the war, and you'll be thinking about how your fictional soldier also feels about this war as we go forward reading this book.